Good evening, or I should say good afternoon, and welcome to the Writer's Block. I'm your host, John Ronan, and as you know now, because we are in our concluding episode of the 30th year, not the final year, just the concluding episode of the 30th year, you know that I interview writers about their craft, what they're working on, what they've accomplished in the past, what they're planning for the future. It's a wide net. We have had on poets and playwrights, novelists, short story writers, journalists, even a couple editors. We even on occasion branch out beyond writing, and we have had on musicians, we have had on actors, we have had on sculptors. There's two sculptors here today I was speaking to. It's a very, very wide net. If you have ideas for a guest who might be right for the Writer's Block, either a writer or other brand of artist, please watch for our address at the end of the program. We'd be glad to get your information, your suggestions for consideration for next year on the Writer's Block. I also want to remind you that the Writer's Block and all the other original programming that comes out of Studio 1623 is a result of cable television, cable access television. It's a valuable and important cultural service that you don't get with other ways of contacting television or bringing them into your house. Stick with cable, stick with the Writer's Block. In connection with the idea that this is an important public service, I want to mention why I introduced the show as good evening, that's out of habit, and good afternoon. We are shooting on a Friday afternoon at Cape Ann Museum, and we've got a full audience in their wonderful auditorium. The person here, the executive who made that possible, is Courtney Richardson. She's very, very adept at public relations and tech aspects of putting on a program such as ours, and I'd like to ask her to stand, if she would, and she's standing already, and give her a big hand. She really was tremendously important. I didn't need these glasses 30 years ago, but they seem to be necessary now. Originally, we were broadcasting as Cape Ann TV. We are now Studio 1623 and living right down the block from the museum in a really new, fancy headquarters. It's kind of like they have in New York in Times Square. You tape a show and you're looking out at all that heavy traffic and the crowds walking by. I'd like to introduce to you the director of Studio 1623 for a couple words to talk to you about the importance of that institution to the cultural life here on Cape Ann. Eric Archer.
Thanks, John. Both mics, Courtney, or just this one? Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me. My name is Eric Archer, and I'm the executive director of 1623 Studios. We are the museum's new neighbor down the street, and we are an evolution of Cape Ann TV, as John mentioned. But we are still very much a community media center. And so that means that we are a public forum for the free exchange of information and ideas. So we are hoping that community members like yourselves, like John, will come to us with their interests and passions and expertise, and we can help them turn that into content. And the Writer's Block with John Ronan represents the very best of community media. And so, 30 years, 30 seasons, introducing hundreds of writers to the Cape Ann community. It's an incredible gift, and I wish we could multiply John and the Writer's Block many times over. So I would just like to thank John for the wonderful work that he's done and encourage all of you to think about your interests and passions and expertise and how you might work with us to package that for the Cape Ann community, because lots of great programs can come out of that about politics and climate and economy and art and all sorts of things. So if that's interesting to you, we are right down the street, and I would love to talk to you about that. But again, I just want to thank John for your involvement. We have been so fortunate to be a part of your work and your success and your incredible stick-to-itiveness. I've never seen anything like it. But it's an amazing thing, and we would like to grow and continue, and maybe some of you in here would be interested in that. So thank you all, and back to you, John. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. Thank you, Eric. And thank you for touching on what is really the theme here today is thanks and gratitude to 1623, the studio, to the staff at the studio, and to all of the artists whose energy and talent and dedication have made my show not only easy, because there's so much talent on Cape Ann, but fun every single year. And I mean that. I really do mean that. I'd like to ask everyone in the audience who has been a guest on the Writer's Block to please stand for a minute. All right. Give yourself a hand. Thank you. Now everybody can sit down except these five folks that you have to get back up. Get back up. These guests were the brave pioneers who appeared on the first season. Not all of the brave pioneers. Some have passed away, some have moved away, some are working, unfortunately. But these fine five folks have volunteered again to be pioneers. They are Sharon Cohen, Chris Leahy, Kim Bartlett, Susan Gerard, and Jackie Fearer. And you're going to meet more about them or learn more about them in just a few minutes. Thank you. Excuse me. At this point, I was originally going to do a more elaborate introduction of those five guests to bring you up to date on what they are doing and what they've been doing. But then it dawned on me that I already introduced them back in 1990. And I might use those same introductions again if I can stand looking at myself from 30 years ago. Thanks to the media work of a friend of mine whose name might be very familiar to you. He's a retired firefighter in Gloucester, Jim Capillo, who's very adept at managing the media when he's not working on cars or flying a helicopter. And he was good enough to put together a clip of parts of the introductions to Sharon, Chris, Kim, Susan, and Jackie. So we're going to show that right now, and then we'll learn a little bit more about where they've been the last 30 years. Tonight's guest is Sharon Cohen. Sharon's a very prolific writer in a variety of styles and a variety of genres. She's published short fiction in McCall's Magazine and Woman's World. She's a former columnist for the Essex County newspapers on Cape Ann. She writes presently and publishes a newsletter for 4th and 5th graders titled Time Ship. Besides all of that, Sharon is a novelist. She's published 4 romantic novels with Mills and Boon, 2 of which were released under their Harlequin imprint. Let's go over now and meet Sharon. Hi, Sharon.
Hi.
How are you?
Okay.
We're going to roll no matter what, even if you stumble over a word, as I just did.
Okay.
We're going to roll. Don't be nervous. I want to ask you something about that title, Time Ship.
Oh,
I didn't warn you about this question.
that's okay.
Where did you get that title?
It's Janet Ware's. It's somebody else's. I don't
We have.
do it all by myself. It's being published by the Cape Ann Historical Association, and I'm working with a group of people, and Janet Ware is the person who really had this idea, and she came up with the title, and it's a great title, it really is.
So it's history for
4th and 5th graders.
4th and 5th graders.
Right.
And that's kind of the title I think that they would respond to.
Oh, yeah.
A little
It's sort of a
sci-fi tone to it.
time travel element to it. And it's fun. Did you read this?
I did. I read
Okay.
especially the article about John Hughes.
Yeah, the man
Big.
who wouldn't die, couldn't
100
die.
cried because God had forgotten him.
Mhm.
Yes.
It's been fun to do.
Do the children write back, or do they respond?
Well,
in
this
any
is
way?
this is our first issue, and the October issue. So we don't know yet. We hope they will.
Tonight's guest is Chris Leahy. Chris is presently the Director of Conservation for the Massachusetts Audubon Society. And among other duties under that position, he helps manage 18,000 acres of sanctuary lands and the Society's international travel operation. In that connection, he has traveled to outer Mongolia, Antarctica, Patagonia, and many other remote climes pursuing wildlife. As a writer, he's also been busy. Chris's works include The Birdwatcher's Companion, about which we'll speak later, The First Guide to Insects, Introduction to New England Birds, and other books. He has just finished a guide to the natural history of New England to be published later this year. And, as if that were not enough to keep him occupied, he also oversees the publication of Sanctuary, the Audubon Society's journal. Let's go over now and meet Chris.
Hi, John.
Hi,
I've also
Chris.
been to Outer Magnolia.
Outer Magnolia,
Not quite
yes.
as-
There aren't as many wildlifes there.
Well, I
think.
don't know. You live in Outer Magnolia.
They're quite different, though, I take it, aren't they? As I hinted before the show, I wanted to ask you, first of all, are you a writer or a naturalist? Or does it make a difference?
I guess it depends on which day you ask me. Yeah, I guess I like to think of myself as both. It's a good combination, I've been interested in natural history. That sort of struck me as when I was a child at some point, and I guess the writing part came along later. But they've always gone together to a certain extent.
One of the most interesting questions I've heard asked on interview shows is, what is your earliest recollection? Was your earliest recollection watching wildlife, observing insects?
I guess the earliest recollection I have in that vein is something close to that. I remember, and I can date it to being age 6, of standing in front of a flowering bush and watching tiger swallowtails nectaring on the blossoms.
Tonight's guest is Kim Bartlett, a nonfiction writer who has lived in Cape Ann for 20 years. For all of those 20 years he's been writing. For 4 of them he got paid regularly. That's when he worked and wrote for the Gloucester Daily Times. For the other 16 years he was self-employed. Some of the products of those 16 years of self-employed writing were the book The Finest Kind, about which we'll talk about in a few minutes, Gulf Star 45, and Buying Time. Besides being a writer and self-employed as a writer, Kim has been employed in other occupations which he later wrote about in his books. He's been, among other things, a seaman, a teacher, a contractor, a fishmonger, and a raiser of turkeys, although he's not raising turkeys anymore, I'm told. Right now, let's go over and meet Kim. Howdy. Thanks for being on the show.
Pleasure.
Nice to have you.
Pleasure.
I wanted to mention, and make sure I emphasized in the introduction, that you combined your real-life work experience with your writing work experience. Can you tell us more about how you did both, and how they came in sequence, and how the ideas came?
Well, yeah. I mean, it's a question of chicken and egg. Basically, I'm the kind of person that likes to be doing things, physically doing things, and traveling and meeting people, et cetera, et cetera. And you have to have a reason for doing these things. I mean, if you're a good Yankee, you have to have a reason for doing things. So writing is really my reason for doing all the various things that I try to get around to doing, which is kind of how I got to writing Finest Kind and Gulf Star and even Buying Time.
Is the writing the reason, or is the writing the excuse to do
Oh,
things that really are interesting?
the writing's the excuse.
To do something you want
To
to
do
do
something
anyway.
I want to do. It's a license to do things that most people aren't generally allowed to do.
Tonight's guest is Susan Gerard. She's both a poet and a freelance writer. Her background in academia includes a PhD in Romance languages from Harvard, and at present she's a professor at North Shore Community College in English. She has written poetry, fiction, movie reviews, and screenplays. Her work has appeared in Ms. Magazine, as well as Sojourner and Cineast, and she's a former editor of InPrint, which is the faculty literary magazine at North Shore Community College. Let's go over now and talk to Susan. Hello, how are you? I'm glad you came. I know you've been looking forward to this for a long time.
Like the play.
Like the plague. How did I do on Cineast?
Beautiful.
Huh?
Excellent.
Huh?
Better than
Did-
they pronounce it.
Did I get than the French?
No,
Or
the,
the people?
editors of the
Oh,
magazine speak French.
what's Cineast mean?
Someone who is a specialist in the cinema.
A little more than a buff and a little less than auteur,
Yeah.
somewhere in there.
That's right.
Since we started on Cineast, can you tell me what you've done for Sojourner in the way of movie reviews and for Cineast?
Several years ago, my career as a movie reviewer started, as most of my writing did, out of extreme passion. In this case, it was hatred for a movie called Flashdance, which was about a woman welder who welds by
I
day
remember.
and ballet dances at night. I thought this movie was so phony and despicable that I was prompted to take pen in hand and write a movie review for Sojourner, and then I started for a couple of years writing reviews for Sojourner. After that, a friend of mine who wrote for Cineast suggested that I send some reviews to Cineast, and I started writing for them on a fairly regular basis, which I've done pretty much up to the present.
Was the Flashdance review accepted?
Yes,
Run?
oh yes, yes.
Tonight's guest is Jackie Bigford. Jackie is an editor and writer who began her career teaching others how to write. She taught in elementary and junior high schools in Rhode Island and Maryland for 12 years. She moved to Gloucester in 1984 and worked for the Essex County newspapers as an editor for 4 years. She had a daughter in 1988, Charlotte, and since then has found it more convenient to work at home as a freelance editor and writer. She's worked for such companies as Houghton Mifflin, Chrysler, Arthur D. Little, and MIT. She's also written features for many Massachusetts magazines. Why don't we go over and talk to Jackie now? Hi, Jackie. Thanks for being here. I appreciate the time. I'm always interested in how writers and editors get to the careers that they've gotten to. You didn't probably want to be a freelance feature writer or editor when you were 5.
I'd like to know about the career in graffiti while we're talking.
The what?
The career in graffiti you were talking about.
We haven't gotten a graffitiist yet, but we're still looking.
Looking back on it, it seems now to have been a natural progression from teaching to writing. No, you don't think at 5 that you want to be an editor or a writer, but I was sort of leaned toward that growing up, but you don't know quite what to do with it. You're not bestowed, a degree as a writer. You don't come by it genetically. You just you do the best you can. So I became a teacher because I love to read and I love to write and I love to talk.
You taught English?
I taught all subjects to 5th, 6th, and 7th graders. So, but I always had in the back of my mind that I wanted to do something else, but I wasn't. Once you start teaching, it's hard to leave. And then so I met someone who had just retired from the CIA and wanted to write about it, and asked me to edit his book, chapter by chapter. And it was really bad. It was really bad, and I didn't know what to do, and he was convinced it was wonderful. So I started taking editing and writing courses at Georgetown University because I was living in Washington.
Now, would the 5 guests, the 5 super guests, come up, follow me up the stairway, please? My first question, as I mentioned I would, as I threatened you with before, is to sum up, if you would, in just a minute or two, what you've been doing for the last 30 years. I'm going to hand this mic to Sharon and ask her to answer first, and then pass it down the line.
Well, okay. I have a husband, a son, a daughter-in-law, and 2 grandchildren, and I've been as alive as I could be. But I think perhaps, are you asking what we've been doing writing for the last 30 years?
It's your show, whatever
It's
you
my
want to talk
show.
about.
I'm going to tell you that I no longer write for money. I do write some for publication. I write part of the Thatcher Island newsletter. The time ship, by the way, that we were discussing in the show went on for quite a while. That was a lot of fun to do. But I now write for the Thatcher Island newsletter, and I write a lot of opinion pieces that I post on Facebook. But other than that, I write all the time. I like to tell people that I have 6 little brains, that, I have a big brain, but these 6 little brains in my finger are usually figuring it out. And I write, I have a wonderful group of women friends, and we write extensively to each other. And I'm very often surprised when I see what my 6 little brains are telling me about my feelings. So that's the answer. I don't write for money anymore, because I don't like marketing. Never did like marketing what I did. Okay?
I'm still writing for money. Not that much, really. Actually, it was a pretty good summary that came through in that first show. I'm just retired from a 45-year career with the Mass Audubon Society, continuing to do all the things that were mentioned. Managing a staff, doing advocacy work, doing ecological management of properties, international travel, that's been a big piece. I was interested that Mongolia came up because that's been a focus, especially recently, of some of my international conservation work, and it's also the subject of the most recent book I've done. So writing has always been a part of my life, my professional life at Mass Audubon, from just doing articles in the publication to doing big fat books and things of that kind. And so I've kept my hand in. I've also started, since I've retired, I've become more engaged in conservation work here on Cape Ann, and I'm now a commissioner on the new Dogtown Preservation Commission. And so that's very interesting and going to take up a significant chunk of my time. So.
Thank you, Chris.
You're welcome, Kim.
I knew at a certain point that the last 30 years of indolence would catch up with me. And I somehow have to explain what I haven't done in the last 30 years. One of the things I haven't done is write for money. If I'd figured out how to do that, I would have continued to write for money. But it's really hard to make money writing. The other thing is, interestingly, listening to that early interview with John, I really like working with my hands. I like physical things. So writing, I have to sit and just stare. And when I'm staring, I think about fixing my tractor. I think about all these other things. So then I went and got a tractor and then worked on the tractor. It was a really old tractor. It was always needing repairs. So that gave me really something to do all day. And also, I did run a turkey farm, the Boundary Turkey Farm. Many of you may have had a turkey from the Boundary Turkey Farm many, many years ago. I built a house for me and my family, which it's still there, still standing, much to my amazement. I also took up woodworking in the sense of bowl turning. So actually, I have a shop in Ipswich, and I turn bowls. And I play some poker. And I lose. I lose very badly, consistently badly. But anyway, it's been an interesting 30 years, and yours is going to be far more interesting than my 30 years.
Wow. Well, for much of the 30 years, I taught with John at North Shore Community College, which is a wonderful was a wonderful institution. It now seems to be turning into job training for the working classes who are not considered good enough to do anything but low-wage jobs. But anyway, for many years I taught there very happily, and I wanted to read a poem that I wrote for one of our students. This is kind of a tribute to the people here who taught, and John taught creative writing like I did. We taught essay writing, we taught literature. But this is a sad poem, but it's very short, so I thought I would read it. It was about one of our students who transferred to Salem State. As I think I said before, I never write anything except when I'm passionate about it, and I write poetry often when I'm extremely sad. I remember waking up weeping when the war in Afghanistan started and wrote a poem about that. But this is a poem about a student who was very talented, beautiful, young, and wanted to be a writer. But somehow she was disappointed in her writing career and she decided to kill herself. So this is called To Rosemary. I know this is kind of a down moment, but again, it's about teaching. I felt like reading poetry when I heard you were dead, starting with your poem, the one about the lonely, moonlit, empty life, the one everyone criticized, the one I criticized, telling myself I was being helpful. Then on to Levertov, as firmly attached to life as a crab, and to Anne Sexton, whom you loved, though I tried to warn you against those long, loose fingers casually draped about life like your own. I felt like reading poetry, and it was fitting, since I was your teacher, and you asked me, is it good? Am I a poet? Will I ever be? Do I have what it takes? I didn't ask you what it took from you. I gave advice about form and meter and the shape of your images like crutches, lied that if you leaned on them you would learn to stand. I gave you crutches, knowing your legs were caving in, your hands loosening. Do I have what it takes? And I said yes, of course, a question of work, a question of determination. Oh, but at last you were determined, left no loose ends. It might have been messy, uncertain, the pills pumped out, the doctors, the dripping love, the reasons. No vague imagery for you, no floating meter, no questions left. The concrete poetry you always craved. You chose a gun and left a note to leave no doubt. Your final poem.
Whoa.
Boom.
Thank you.
Did you have something to say?
Well, since retirement, I wrote a book on Dickens and Dante, which was termed counterintuitive, because I have a passion for Dickens. And I joined the UU Church and do Buddhist meditation and spend time with my family and friends and do political activism around immigration. And I have been an activist my whole life and continue to be one.
That's a tough one to follow. I have absolutely no hobbies, so I'm still writing and I'm writing for money. And the thing is that when I was on the show 30 years ago, I was home with a 2-year-old and I wasn't sure what I was going to be doing next. And so my friends from the newspapers, because you make no money when you work for a newspaper, they all left and went into academia, publishing, magazines, ad agencies, that kind of thing. So they call me and they go, hey, you're home. Can you write this article? Can you do this Q&A? Can you do this? And I ended up with 18 clients. One of them was Fidelity Investments. And they said, when you're done with that mother thing, do you want to come and start a newspaper and be a speechwriter for our operating committee? So they didn't want to wait for my daughter to go to school, so they were just sending a limo to my house in Gloucester and taking her to school so that I could be there for like 18 hours a day. She doesn't remember any of that, thank God. So I ended up at Fidelity Investments for 24 years. I actually took the voluntary buyout with 1,500 other people in 2017, but they brought me back for a year. And then I was home and I was on a couple of boards, including Veterans Legal Services, and was loving that. And my friends from Fidelity started calling me and saying, hey, you're home. And so I've been doing, I don't think I've ever applied for a job, ever. Just have lots of great friends who had great jobs themselves. So I have clients, I'm an executive coach, and I'm still a speechwriter.
Thank you. Keep that, I've got my own. The second question on my list here is, can you think of some highlight in your career or careers that stands out that you could share with us? And I would like to go back the other direction now and start with Jackie. I'm wondering if when you were at Fidelity, you bought 1,000 shares of Microsoft the day it went public.
They never let me give money, ever.
No.
And I was on the communication side. You know, I always feel like a highlight is when I learn something. And actually, my boss from Fidelity is here today. Suzanne, raise your hand. I learned so much from her. She's brilliant. And we had a lot of fun together. But I remember when I was having a review with her one year. And you probably don't even remember this, Suzanne. But we had a lot of fun, and we were doing great things. And people think of Fidelity as being, you know, my daughter once said to me, how can you work for a company that just wants to make money? And I said, no, we're keeping working America from eating cat food in retirement. And we're making sure that people do have a retirement, right? So Suzanne said to me at my review, okay, I'm going to tell you something, and I don't want you to forget it, which of course I didn't because I'm telling you now. She said, you make everything look too easy. You make everything you do look too easy, which think about that. So I was a writer, I was an editor, I was a speechwriter, I was doing all that. Never saying no to anything. People would say, can I have this by tonight at 6 o'clock? And I go, sure. And Suzanne said, you need to stop doing that. So I think all of us as writers, and probably you're not even hearing me, all of us as writers need to remember that it may come easy for us, but what we do for people who are brilliant at what they do, but they can't write about it, right? So that's the fun of it, is I can interview people, and Tom Cronin, my friend here, he was on the cover of a magazine that I was doing, interviewing him, learning about, you know, what drives him and how successful he was in business and why, and then I get to write about it, which is a wonderful thing.
Thank you.
Very hard for me to talk about highlights. I guess a highlight of my writing career was actually selling a screenplay to a Hollywood producer, though it never got made. It was about sexual harassment on state police force, and I co-wrote it with a retired state policeman who had the story and who became a progressive radical activist after his experience there. But I think a highlight of my life was actually being part of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. That was probably the highlight of my whole life.
It wasn't seeing Flashdance?
I'll just say one thing about Flashdance. The reason it upset me so much was that I did work as a welder in the Quincy shipyard, and I knew for a fact that you didn't just go on ballet dancing after a full shift.
First of all, I'm trying to think of what inspired me. Why don't you tell them what inspired you?
Okay. Well, as I get older, I'm more and more grateful for the opportunity I've had to travel all over the world. I've been to 90 plus countries and leading trips, not just, you know, looking around or something, but having to get to know those countries. Yes, their wildlife, their natural history, but one of the most important thing about the experience is getting to know the cultures and the people. Some of the places that I've come to sort of love best, and there certainly will be highlights of my memory, are kind of out-of-the-way places. I mentioned Mongolia earlier. I've been involved in there for, again, at least 30 years and still have many friends there. And places like Bhutan, countries in West Africa, places that are a little bit, shall we say, out of the way, sometimes difficult, always providing a certain number of adventures, but especially giving me the opportunity to meet incredible people from different cultures and sort of see their worldview. I so wish so many more people, especially in this country, could have that opportunity and have a little more better appreciation for those cultures. So those are the top of my highlight list. Back to you, Kim.
Yeah, why did you pass up, Kim?
Why did I gas up?
Why did you, what? Yeah, why
He was
did you pass-
thinking.
Trying to think of anything.
Well, did you bring something to show us?
Well, yeah, I did, but,
Well, how about that?
all right, John said, a little show and tell. And this is what I've done for the last 30 years. There's one of my little bowls.
Beautiful.
And here's a,
Wow.
Kim is a wood carver and sculptor in wood, and he has a website. You want to give us your website?
no, I don't have a website yet.
I went to your website.
You're the first one, John.
Okay, well, the miracles of digital.
Actually, I just, one of the things that truly inspired me to go in the direction I did was I had perhaps it was a privilege of having a pretty fancy education up to a certain point, which meant I didn't pay a whole lot of attention to anything but the privilege that came with it. And then, fortunately, that was yanked out from underneath me, and I had to actually get a real job. And my real job was working as a shipping clerk for an outfit called Durand Confectionery Candy in Cambridge. Probably nobody has ever heard of Durand Confectionery Candy. It was over in Leechmere Square, and they sent out lots of candy to Kansas City, from what I can gather, from all the boxes of candy I sent to Kansas City. And what was inspiring, what really got me there was suddenly dealing with people like Pop, who ran the elevator of this place down on Atlantic Avenue. And Pop had been one of those guys that had traveled through the Adirondacks, going to small towns and taking on everybody. You know, he was fighting for money. He would take on the strongest guy, the fastest guy. And that's how Pop made a living. And at the Taft School in Connecticut, they didn't have a whole lot of Pops. And all of a sudden, Pop was in my life. And I said, there are going to be more Pops out there. And then the other thing that amazed me was that you had all these boxes of candy. And if you went to Durand Confectionery, you saw the lines of people putting the candy in the boxes, et cetera, et cetera. And I kept saying to myself, every one of those people who was putting something in the candy in the box, et cetera, probably had a really good evening or a really lousy evening, really having trouble with their husband, with their wife, maybe they're having trouble with a dog, but while they're putting it in, these are things that are going on in their heads. So each one of these pieces of candy comes with a backstory. The people, in point of fact, put it there, and then it goes on a truck to Kansas City, and it sits in a nice little candy store, and some guy wants to impress his girlfriend, or the other way around, and buys this box of candy, which I've put on the truck, in which these people have said, God, I've had a lousy life, and here goes another. And the person who gets the candy says, oh, that's so good. You know, and the line of people that have touched that piece of candy so impressed me. So all my books basically are not how to fish, but it's the people who do the fishing. Not how you work on how oil how oil rigs work. It's all the wahoos from Alabama and the Kunasses from southern Louisiana and their lives. That's what makes it exciting and fun. That's my inspiration.
Thank you, Kim. That was a poem. I don't know if you realize that.
What?
That was a poem about the candies in Leechmere Square. Chop that up into short little lines and sell it. Sharon.
I've had a lot of highlights in my life, a lot of highlights. So I'm going to tell you about something that happened yesterday, because it's right in the front of my brain. 50 years ago, which is a strange way to talk about yesterday, I had a lawsuit, and the lawsuit resulted in women in the military being able to collect merit housing allowances. So I'm sort of on the, what I call the crusty old lady circuit, when people want to do some women's history. And 2 days ago, I was on a panel at Maxwell Air Force Base in Montgomery, Alabama, which was my home base when I filed the suit. I was on a spectacular panel that there was a 100-year-old World War II motor pool, Army motor pool driver. There were master sergeants, women. There were at least 4 women, I think 5 on that panel out of 7 who had served in war zones. And the undisputed center of power on that panel was one of the first 5 Air Force women, enlisted women, to be assigned to Vietnam. And she told a little bit about being caught in the Tet Offensive, and she broke down. And the major next to me slid over and held her so that she could continue what she was saying. And I flew back with her. I flew out of Montgomery to Atlanta. And we got on the plane and we talked, we asked, and the young woman who was sitting with her agreed to switch seats. So I had a lot of time to talk to Rita. And Rita, there was a lot Rita wasn't talking about. And I knew enough. She had just let slip a day or two before that she had gone there to follow a man and the man had not come back. And in the course of talking to her, she was telling me how little she had talked about what happened to her in Saigon and would still not talk about what happened to the man. And she was a woman who, you know, I hadn't liked her when I met her. She came off as sort of an officious, kind of spunky widow. And talking to her on this flight, this is going to sound awful. I thought, this is a woman who has a dead man right under her skin, and he can't get out. And so I was talking to her about writing. You know, have you ever done any writing? And I was encouraging her to write. I was encouraging her to write not alone in her condo, you know, but to find like a veterans writers project like we have here with the Writers Center. Or, you know, I was giving her some suggestions for finding a way to write, and she was listening. I think she was scared. But I bring this up, and it's in my brain so clearly right now, because I became aware of how powerful writing is, not to produce a product, or not to communicate with friends, or but to actually go back to the foundation of who you are and try to explain yourself, to explain your 22-year-old self to your 75-year-old self, and to have the 75-year-old self comfort in some way the 22-year-old self, and how incredibly healing writing can be. And I wrote her again this morning. And I hope I hear from her. But this is a little more emotional than I intended to be. I just want to say that writing is enormously powerful, and your reading of that poem was enormously powerful. And writing is something beyond something nice to do. That's what I want to say.
Thank you,
Get this
Sharon.
out of my hands now.
Thank you, Sharon. I want to have a couple minutes to ask the audience to present questions, but before I do, I have one quick question for all of you. And also, Chris, you brought some books, you can hold them up at this point. One quick sentence of advice to somebody starting out in writing or any other career. Jackie, the sentence of advice.
I would say use your writing talent to help others, and volunteer to write eulogies and wedding toasts, and go to nonprofit organizations and say, is anyone giving a speech? Do you need help with your program? You know, use your writing talents to branch out into lots of things that aren't necessarily for money. The other thing I want to say about that is that with young people, because I was at Fidelity for so long, I was always the oldest person in the building. And so I have a lot of friends who are in their 30s, and I would never presume to teach them anything. Like, they teach you every day. They teach all of us boomers who think we are mentoring them. It's really the other way around. I love millennials, I love all of them, and they amaze me. And where I started out in conference rooms going, you know, you really should, I stopped doing that pretty quickly because I was taking notes more than they were. So give them some credit and let them bloom and branch out, encourage them to write everything.
Thank you.
I guess I'd say, write what you love, and not for money, because you won't make any, usually. And also, if you really are serious about writing, be like John and not like me, but really see it as a craft and as work and something that you persist on and do and keep doing. And I just have to have a shout out to John, who I respect as a poet, who's worked on his craft for many, many years and has become a very good poet.
I'm saying to myself, well, ever so often I look in the mirror these days and I say, now what was that argument about making money? You know, when you're young, you say, you know, I really don't need to make money. The other things of value besides making money. Well, figure out what to do to make money, and the other thing is brush your teeth. And the older you get, the worse your teeth get, and the more expensive they become. And such that if you haven't prepared yourself for that moment when it's really knocking you off the pedestal, you know, brush your teeth, floss.
I'm anything nearly as practical as that. This echoes what others have said in one sense, but I think for me, part of the reward of writing, which I enjoy, but as all writers know, is really hard. But part of, I guess, the enjoyment is, when you get it right, and you feel that it's right, and other people tell you that it's right, and that kind of thing. But I guess for me, the most important thing has been that I've essentially written for a cause. As I said in that earlier interview, I've been a naturalist. I've been enthralled with the natural world since I was a very small boy, and to have amazingly gotten a job in which I could write and feel that I was doing something potentially to help save the world, so to speak. Not going all that well these days, but I'm trying. I think that's one of the most important things for me about writing.
I hate emojis, and I would encourage people to stop communicating with each other through, I heart, whatever else is there, and actually string together a couple of sentences and, and write each other. Like I said, I have this group of women I communicate with we send emails, but there are letters. They're old-fashioned letters that contain full ideas in full paragraphs, and it's just a wonderful gift back and forth. So I would encourage people who want to write to make their personal writing and their personal communication beautiful and meaningful and coherent.
Thank you, Sharon.
Can I add something to that?
Sure.
Did I see John Christie here?
Yes.
Is John here?
Hi.
Hi, John.
Hi, Jack.
John hired me 100 years ago, and I had been a teacher, and I knew nothing about newspapers, even though I considered myself a writer. And John was so patient with me, because I really knew nothing. And I remember two things he said to me. One is, I had Friday night duty, and there had been a plane crash in Newfoundland, I think. And John comes running in, and he said, did they send a list out yet on the AP Wire about who died and whatnot, or anyone on the plane? I said, yeah. And he said, was anyone from the North Shore on the list? And I went, And the other thing is, so I've been OCD ever since then. The other thing John did was, I wrote an article on, I think, woodworking. And maybe it was you, I don't know, I interviewed a woodworker. And so I wrote this piece, I was really happy with it. And John calls me into his office and said, natural wood? You wrote natural wood. What is unnatural wood? He said, no adjectives, no adverbs. And I think that's today why I'm such a spare writer. I'll never write a novel because I'm so spare. I get it down to like this. Yeah, so thank you, John.
Thank you. While they were saying what advice they would give, I couldn't think of any advice I have, but I remembered Sheldon asking in one of the Big Bang episodes, Obi-Wan Kenobi, played by Bob Newhart, give me a piece of advice that I can take and use for all my life. And Obi-Wan pauses for a long time and then says, get a prenup. We have a couple more minutes. I have an hour. I would like to ask the audience if you have any questions for our guests up here. This will be kind of truncated, but if you do, yes, sir.
So, Jackie,
Wait just a second, we'll get a mic over to you.
we're left hanging, Jackie. Did that agent's book that was so poorly written ever get produced? Did it reach print?
I've never seen it since then. I also didn't look for it, but no, I don't think so. But you know, the thing is that so many people think that because they have a great story, they can write it beautifully. But I love interviewing people because you can take their story and help them write it, right? Because, you know, I love the stories, the extraordinary stories of ordinary people. Everyone has a story. Everyone has a secret. It could be a good secret, it could be a bad secret, but everyone has a story, right? And he had a great story as a CIA agent, and he had just come off the statute of limitations or whatever it is for revealing where he'd been and whatnot. But he insisted on writing that story. He insisted on no edits. So I finally said to him, write it for your family, write it for your children, because no one's going to read this book. But anyway.
Any other? If there are no more questions, then maybe I will do my usual close. I want to thank our first-year pioneers very much for being so brave to go on the show before you or anybody else knew what it was going to be like. It was great to have you then, and greater even now to have you this time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thank you and our live audience, and all of you who are going to watch this later in television land. I'll give you my standard close now. Thank you for watching The Writer's Block. If you've learned something about art and writing and the importance of it in life from our 5 guests tonight, then The Writer's Block has done its job. I hope to see you again next year on The Writer's Block. Good night.